Welcome to the Delingpole podcast with me, James Delingpole. Before I introduce this week's incredibly exciting guest, and I know a lot of you have been asking for him for quite some time, his name is Douglas Murray, and he's got a brilliant book out, The Strange Death of Europe, about immigration and the surrender of Western cultural values. But I thought I ought to mention that the interview was recorded before the Manchester bombing, before the Manchester suicide bombing at the Ariana Grande concert. So although a lot of what we say is very germane to this hideous atrocity, we don't actually cover it because it happened after the interview. Thanks very much for listening. Enjoy the show. Welcome to the Delingpole podcast with me, your special friend, James Delingpole. My special guest is sniggering. He obviously hasn't listened to enough podcasts to realise that this is what I do every week, isn't it, friend? And anyway, my very special and exciting guest this week is none other than Douglas Murray. Welcome, Douglas.
Very good to be with you again, James.
But, Douglas, people have been pleading and begging with me to have you on the show. It's taken all this time, but finally we've tracked you down. And this is a very opportune moment because you have just written what I think is going to be set to be the most enormous bestseller. It's already on track to be one, isn't it? I mean, you're zooming up the bestseller list in the UK.
Yeah.
And it's coming out in America
in the 15th of June. It was meant to come out in September, but it's been brought forward. So it's middle of June. It'll be out in the US and Canada, and it'll be out in Australia from the 1st of June.
So the good thing is that if you're American or Australian and you just fall in love with Douglas, as many of us have, and you want to buy his book, you'll be able to go there and get it pretty soon. The book is called The Strange Death of Europe, and the subtitle is Immigration, Identity and Islam. And I have to say, it's incredibly bloody depressing. Isn't it? I mean, it's beautifully written and incisive and incredibly well informed, and I love your feline style. It's just, if I were writing this book, I'd be straight in there and saying, "God, this is awful," and I'd be turning it up to 11. But that's not your style.
No, I suppose not. And I mean, I would have driven myself as well as my readers mad, I think, by a few pages in, if I had have taken that stance. My own view was that this was a book I wanted to write as if it was a history of the present, and that being the case, you have to stand back from it a bit and survey the whole landscape, which is what I try to do. Not just the landscape of the migration crisis into Europe that is overwhelming our continent and has been for some years now, but the moral crisis, the values crisis, all of those things behind it. And to really ask and to try to answer what I think is the most interesting question is not why is this happening to us, but why are we allowing it to happen to ourselves? And yes, some of that is a little feline along the way. There's a moment that I say quite early on when I dismantle the various myths of why we need mass migration into Europe from the third world. And I say among the myths, of course, the myth that third world migrants make us richer and and so on, more interesting and more diverse and all of these sort of things, and I explain them one by one. And there is a moment when I say that, I mean, the deal seems to have been arranged at by our political elites, that although it's true we have a bit more gang rape and beheading than we used to have, on the plus side we have a wider range of cuisine to choose from. So it's a balancing act, isn't it?
I think it works very well because the last book I read that this was this bleak was Mark Stein's After America, and he did another one, I think,
America Alone. Terrific books.
Both those books, and I suppose that the reason they stood out is because they were voices in the wilderness, weren't they?
Yes.
People still aren't saying this stuff.
No. Mark Stein and very few others. I go through some of them in the book as a sort of history of the counter-reformation, or whatever you would call it, of this area. I mean, it's a few people. Bruce Bauer was another one, wrote While Europe Slept about 12 years ago now, a bit more. There were a few people, and I describe them in my book as the early warning sirens, the things that went off across the continent early that we should have listened to. The obvious early warning siren was the Rushdie affair in 1989 over the satanic verses.
That was the first time. I don't think any of us had heard the word fatwa before that time.
No, I mean, now it's part of our daily lives, of course. But, 1989, the Rushdie fatwa was a first. But there were a whole set of sirens that went off. I say in the book, there were ones like Pim Fortuyn in the Netherlands, a left, gay, Marxist academic who wasn't described as a far-right maniac until he got onto the subject of Islam and immigration. Bruce Bauer, a gay American expat, comes to Europe and realizes it isn't what he thought it was and it's changing. And he sounds off again. They try to shut him down. Oriana Fallaci, a lifelong left-wing anti-fascist Italian writer, goes off in New York with an early warning siren about Europe. A whole set of people, politicians and others, all of them dismissed, all of them derided. And one of the points I try to make in the book that I think is so important to make about this is, if you take each of those people and you take their bleakest prediction, the reality is infinitely worse. So, I say at one point in the book, Enoch Powell in Britain is the obvious person to cite. When Enoch Powell gave his famous Rivers of Blood speech in 1968, if you'd have been his speechwriter and said, Enoch, I've got a great idea. Why don't you in this speech say that in the census carried out in 2011 in Britain that will be published in 2012, you should say that by then, with immigration at this rate, 23 out of the 33 London boroughs will have people who identify as white British as being in a minority. Enoch Powell would have said, I won't do an impression.
Oh, please do.
Would have said something along the lines of, you're trying to make me out to be a madman. I'm not going to say anything so crazy. But lo and behold, it came to pass. Far more extreme prediction of the future turned out to be what actually happened. Another example I give in the book, it's not to say that I'm giving him a rave review, this is a history of these events, is the French writer Jean Raspail, who wrote this famous novel, The Camp of the Saints, that's a sort of a subterranean classic about a third world horde arriving on the south coast of France, 1 million of them landing in ships. He wrote that in the early 1970s. Everyone said this is a maniac, this is racist, and so on. Actually, the novel is ugly, and it is a bit racist. But the point is that in 2011, Jean Raspail is interviewed on French television, and they say, look, actually, a lot of your vision seems to be coming true. This is very interesting, but the numbers never happened. And he says in 2011, no, it's true. We never had 1 million people coming in one go.
And yet, when you say this kind of stuff, anyone who says this kind of stuff, we saw what happened with Enoch Powell. We've seen what happened with, look at Welbeck.
Yes.
He's now living in hiding. I don't know what Bruce Bauer's doing, but I can't imagine he's very comfortable in. Where is he living now?
As far as I know, he's in Scandinavia.
Right. Okay. But generally, people who stick their head above the parapet haven't fared that well in the broader media, and sometimes have been killed, like Pim Fortuyn.
Yes, I say that in the book. That effectively, Europe's response to these early warning sirens was either to kill them, allow them to be killed, or basically set them up for living death. It was just exile within the community.
Interesting phrase they use, allow to be killed, because this is something that I think that the liberal left, there are notable exceptions. Nick Cohen, for example, has taken against his own kind, at least on the subject of Islam.
And has given a wonderful rave for this book.
But Cohen is the exception. The bien-pensants, the chattering classes, have generally, I think, made life more dangerous for people who raise these points by making them out to seem like they're racist.
Yes.
You give some examples of the kind of typical people who appear on the BBC. You've got Will Self. I love the way you put in brackets, currently Professor of Contemporary Thought at Brunel University. You don't even need to put an exclamation mark there or anything.
No.
And you quote him on the BBC discussion show Question Time, And here's Will Self. He says, up to the Suez Crisis, most people's conception of what being British involved was basically going overseas and subjugating black and brown people and taking their stuff and the fruits of their labours. That was a core part of British identity, was the British Empire. Now various members of the political class have tried to revive that idea quite recently without much success. Yes. And he was applauded. And you get applause on the BBC for that kind of tripe.
Yes, and I quote that because that was the question time on the week that the census I just referred to came out. A picture of Britain. Britain has escaped the recent migrant crisis by comparison with the continent, because we're not in the Schengen area, of course. But in Britain, I say even a country which has been able to be slightly removed from the recent crisis, Britain, this is what's happened to it. And that census that was revealed in the 2011 census should have been a year's worth of discussion, a generational discussion, and it went by in about 3 or 4 days. And one of the things that was said in those 3 or 4 days where there was actually a discussion was that question time where, yes, Will Self said, basically, we are rampaging racist thieves. And that's all we are. And with that added calumny that there are people in the British government recently who've been trying to start that up again. Yeah. I mean, and this comes back to the same thing. It's the Pim for Time point. It's the thing about setting people up. If you keep on saying everybody is Hitler on that side, then some, as with the case of Pim for Time, will pick up a gun and shoot the Hitler wannabe, as in America happened with a number of people who said that Trump was Hitler. You know, it was a British student who is arrested at a rally for trying to seize a policeman's gun and shoot Donald Trump. Well, if you've been brainwashed into thinking that the person is Hitler, who hasn't had fantasies of going back in time and killing Hitler? Yeah. And this is the opportunity all the time, because a certain portion, particularly of the left, continually sets people up for assassination.
Yeah. I remember having a similar experience. I was doing one of the BBC's Sunday morning shows, and we were talking about British history. And there was one of those sort of female historians, I won't mention her name, I won't shame her, although she probably deserves it. One of those pretty girls who's always on history programmes, always popping up right, left and centre. And there was an Islamist, a guy who avowedly despises British history and says he's got nothing to recommend in it, and bangs on about the Bengal famine. That's right. It's his main take-home message. And I was in the position of saying, well, hang on a second. Britain's got lots to be proud of historically, and we shouldn't be ashamed, and our children shouldn't be ashamed of it, and actually they should be taught to celebrate their history, to create social cohesion. Did I get any fire support from this female historian? No. It's much easier to throw me to the Islamist guy.
Yes.
Because when I want to explain the mentality there.
That's a very interesting one. I mean, this is what Roger Scruton calls the culture of self-repudiation. It's that your culture should be a shrugging off of your culture. This is what we've been for a long time. This is what Europe is. This is one of the existential crises underneath us. The oddity of this is, I mean, I say at one point, there's a long chapter in the book about historical guilt and the way in which it works in Europe, and indeed in America and Australia and Canada these days. And one of the things about this that's fascinating is that every educated person I know knows that every single culture in history has done terrible things, and many have done great things. And so that the question is what you focus on. Now, a crazed, as it were, propagandist for a country would obviously only talk about the great things. But when people are only willing to talk about the bad things, you know you're dealing with a propagandist for someone else. You're not dealing with a critic, you're dealing with an enemy. You're dealing with somebody who doesn't want you to get better, they want you to die. So one of the things that I find fascinating, and I talk about this at length in the book, is take it when I'm sure we'll come on to the Islam bit, but take the Islam bit for a moment. If you enter a discussion show in Britain, America, or anywhere else these days, and the subject of Islam comes up, you'll be almost immediately onto the Islamic Neoplatonists. These are the people who, Averroes and so on, who are now said widely to have saved European culture for us.
From the Dark Ages.
From the Dark Ages. and we were dwelling in basically mud, and the Muslim world was basically Silicon Valley, and this is the sophisticated thing to say. I give an example in the book of a French academic who wrote an article that was disputing the historicity of this point, who was screamed out of the academy in France because effectively what he did was a modern form of blasphemy. The modern gospel is of the Muslim world having given us everything we have, and we, by contrast, were the bad people. Now, the fascinating thing about this is, when I debate Islamists, and when I debate people like Tariq Ramadan, for instance, one of his consistent points against me, his consistent claims is Murray is essentializing Islam. And to the extent that we can translate this into non-wankerese, essentializing is to boil something down to a simple essence, which is oversimplifying the case, and usually in a negative way. Now, one of the things I find fascinating about this, whether I essentialize Islam or not, is these people all essentialize the West. Your Islamist on your program will go straight onto the Crusades. I give an example in the book of an American delegation I once heard of visiting Yasser Arafat to apologize for the Crusades, and Yasser Arafat bursting out laughing. He knew. But they'll be straight onto the Crusades or Empire or so on. They will never say, well, it's true 1,000 years ago your countries were involved in a movement that pushed back against the movement the Muslim world was involved in. It was a war of religions over the Middle East and territory and so on. And then they'll say, but on the other hand, you did give the Enlightenment to the world, and the Baroque and the Renaissance and the greatest flowerings of human ingenuity and science and mathematics and arts. So we recognize, good with the bad. They never say that. Of course not. They essentialize us. And the curious thing is, we are willing to be essentialized. We have absorbed this story of ourselves as rampaging racists and people who just go out and commit racial crimes across the world. We've taken on that version of our own history.
Well, you say we. We're talking about quite a narrow definition of. We're talking about the chattering classes, the sort of educated elite, aren't we?
Yes, but that stuff doesn't half have a trickle-down effect and a demoralizing effect on everyone else.
Right.
I mean, to give another example, quite often in the book I say, let's turn this stuff round. One of the arguments for mass migration into Europe, and Europe allegedly needing to take in everyone in the world who wants to not just flee a bad situation, but to flee economic deprivation, is the argument that we did wrong in the world, and we had empires, and therefore this is what they call the Empire Strikes Back syndrome. I say that if that is the case, then they should recognize that one of the largest and most significant empires in history was the Ottoman Empire. And yet I have never heard anyone say that Turkey must be punished for its empire, and must be punished in particular by having its culture totally eroded, by having mass migration from all directions of the world, and that this must lead eventually to the destruction of Turkish identity. I have never heard that, and I would think that such a person would be a bit of a maniac.
And this does create idiocies like, do you remember when Greg Dyke, the guy in charge of the BBC, lamented the fact that the BBC was hideously white? And we laughed then, but now the BBC has these policies where they have essentially quota systems, don't they?
Yes.
For the number of ethnic minorities they have to have on each programme. And
yes, this is one of the things I hope that my critics, as well as people who broadly agree with me, will take up, is the point I make in this speech about the idea. There's a long passage on multiculturalism, and one of my points about this is we think that multiculturalism, as in or let's say a pluralistic society, brings only benefits. And I say, well, it obviously brings some benefits, and there are some nice things about it, and we all know what they are. But we never ever dwell on the negative bits. And the negative bits include the fact that it looks like, as a result of the mass immigration into Europe in particular, we are going to spend the rest of our lives talking about race. Skin colour, identity, it's going to be endless. And that's one of the results of this. And as I say, if you bring in the world's people, you also bring in the world's problems and the world's resentments. And you discover that everybody from everywhere in the world doesn't arrive into Europe and immediately breathe the air of Europe and live in the spirit of Voltaire and St. Paul, Dante, Bach, and so on. Of course they don't.
Are there any exceptions in Europe where are there any countries where people retain their national pride? I saw some footage only the other day of Angela Merkel on a stage, and someone was waving the German flag, and she waved it away. She was furious. She wanted to get rid of that appalling symbol.
Yes.
So the Germans have obviously lost it. Are there any countries that... Because I would have thought the French, for example, being quite chauvinistic, would still...
I say in this book a lot about this, and the spreading round of German guilt is one of the big problems for the continent, where we essentialize ourselves. We are responsible for the Second World War. We are responsible for the Holocaust.
Us as well?
Oh yeah.
Not me, Gov.
Yeah, I know. I mean, even in a country that fought Nazism, the spreading round of German guilt is across the entire culture. We did this. And, of course, if you believe you did so many bad things, how could you possibly not need to be punished? And so that is one big problem. The French have a fascinating thing, which is identity. That there is a strong French identity. I've often said France doesn't get enough praise for this. If you put any other country through France has been through in the last 2.5 years, I'm not sure it would have come out as well as France has done. Imagine a situation in Britain where all of our most prominent satirical cartoonists were murdered, and then a priest was slaughtered at the shrine of his church, and the multiple suicide bombings across London and so on. I'm not sure, but I think that the British reaction could have been more febrile than the French reaction. But the French still have this strong sense of identity of the state, of the republic, and that has its virtues. By the way, I also quote off record a French official who, whilst I was travelling, I've been travelling all across the continent, from the reception points in the Greek and Italian islands, all north across Scandinavia, the suburbs of French and German towns. And I'm very attuned by now to the little bits that what people say when they really reveal what they mean. The book ends with a conversation with a German MP in the Bundestag in Berlin. But it also mentions a French official who at one point I was speaking in private to, I don't name them for obvious reasons, I was speaking to, and I said, how come France dodged the scale of the migration that Germany and the Scandinavian countries got in 2015 when Merkel opened the doors in what in this book I see as the historic moment on the last day of August 2015. I said, why has France managed to dodge the worst of that? And this French official said, well, of course, there are some advantages to being widely regarded as a racist country.
You're listening to Delingpole, the podcast with me, James Delingpole, and my incredibly special guest, Douglas Murray, author of The Strange Death of Europe. More in a moment.
Breitbart News Daily with Alex Marlow.
Tim Schmidt is joining us now. He's a president and founder of U.S. Concealed Carry Association.
The best part about concealed carry is that everybody doesn't have to do it for the vast majority of the population to get the benefit. You're going to have this powerful deterrent effect. Naturally, crime will go down because they're never going to know who's going to have the gun.
Breitbart News Daily, weekdays from 6 a.m. to 9 a.m. East on SiriusXM Patriot 125.
This is Delingpole, a Breitbart.com podcast. Here once again is James Delingpole.
Welcome back to Delingpole, the podcast with me, James Delingpole, and my very special guest, Douglas Murray. Let me tell you that in the last section, the one after this one, Douglas and I are going to relieve the gloom slightly by answering the question, what can be done about all this? There must be something. Otherwise, I think we'd all be jumping out the window at this point. But before we get there, I want to cover some more depressing stuff with you, if you don't mind, Douglas. I know how you hate dwelling on the miserable aspects of this, but I think we're going to have to. One of the things I've noticed, every time there is a new terrorist atrocity, a new Islamic terrorist atrocity, in whether it's Nice or Paris, Bataclan, or the killing of the Charlie Hebdo cartoonists or whatever, there's an immediate, visceral response that everyone has, which is, God, this is awful. This is the worst thing. It can't get any worse than this. And then very, very quickly, this subsides into candles and projection of the flag on the Eiffel Tower or whatever the relevant structure is. And then very, very quickly, it's almost as if everyone wants to forget what's happened.
Yes. Yes, that speeds up all the time. The desire, by the way, to get a good news story from it is something I've observed for a long time. That's not that unusual, by the way. I mean, you can hear that in what Mark Stein calls the sort of tilty-headed wankerishness of a lot of our culture. I heard somebody recently, a young Jewish man, talking about the Holocaust, and he mentioned how important it is we get something good from it. And I was sort of left saying, it's not obvious to me that 6 million people needed to be gassed in order that you could then get something good from it. I mean, it's an odd thing of this age where we think it's important that we don't get down and that we find a way to pull the good news out of something. And I don't mind if people want to do that personally, in a personal tragedy. I mind it deeply on behalf of other people. It's a shame that all those people died in Paris, but on a good note, some Ahmadiyya Muslims joined hands and had a candle vigil.
That's something you've pointed out several times, and it's often misreported in the media, that these are just called Muslims. They're never pointed out as Ahmadiyya Muslims, who are considered a heretical sect.
Yes, and who are deeply persecuted. And indeed, an Ahmadiyya Muslim was murdered recently in Britain by another Muslim for being an Ahmadiyya Muslim.
And on Westminster Bridge,
yes,
when Muslim women gathered in a line, they were Ahmadiyya.
It's always an Ahmadiyya protest against the thing. Now, I'm delighted by that, by the way. I'm delighted the Ahmadiyya Muslims are there and speaking out. However, as I say, they're a minority within a minority. And no, I mean, that's just one of the things. But the good news hauling from the tragedy has become so indecently hasty of late that in the case of the Westminster attack earlier this year, the bodies weren't buried before the nation had sort of moved on with the good news. There was a memorial service in Westminster Abbey shortly after, I think a fortnight after the attacks, but before the burials of the dead. And among other sort of interfaith harmony-ness, the Dean of Westminster gave a sermon in which he said, we may never know what would cause somebody to drive a car into a bunch of people they don't know and could never know, and then stab an innocent policeman repeatedly. We may never know.
Was he Norwegian, perhaps? Or Swedish?
The vicar...
Mentally ill. I don't know. What possible reason could he have, Douglas? Tell me.
It's one of the most fascinating things, is because the desire to not know is very strong. And then when you do get the answer, nobody comments on it. So actually, a few weeks after that, as I said would happen, you wait around a bit, wait for the facts. We need the facts to know, actually, sometimes there are people who are mentally ill and have nothing to do with it, who do crazy things, and sometimes it's because they're inspired by Allah and their reading of Islam. And on this occasion, it turned out that the man who killed the policeman outside the Houses of Parliament, and who rammed the car into all those people on Westminster Bridge, actually sent a message just before he died to a mate, via WhatsApp, saying, I'm doing this for jihad and looking forward to meeting the virgins in paradise stuff. So, and what doesn't happen, and there's no force in our society that pushes it to happen, is we don't have anyone who says, look, Dean of Westminster, how about coming back out and saying, actually, we do know now, and we have to address this problem. That never happens. You just have the national non-recognition of facts thing, and the tilty-headedness and all of that, and the candles, and the how can we get something good from this tragedy. It's really indecent, and as you say, it happens faster and faster with each attack.
What I've also noticed is that in the immediate Twitter frenzy that follows these events, what a lot of people do is they look around for a white right-wing person to blame. So
yes, of course.
They look for Katie Hopkins' tweets.
Yes.
Katie Hopkins has said something offensive.
So, Nigel Farage.
Nigel Farage.
Yes. Yes, someone always says something like, this is why we must be more careful with immigration, or something like that. And everybody immediately leaps on them. But I've always found the fascinating question that why? The simple fact is, I think, and this is settling in, even with some people who would never want to agree with anything I say or anything you say, the fact is that they know what to do with Katie Hopkins or Nigel Farage, and they know that they can attack them and ridicule them and be incredibly mean and whatever they like, and all that they get is a benefit. Their mates will say, yeah, exactly, you really flamed Katie Hopkins and that, like, you destroyed Nigel Farage with that tweet. Whereas if you think, as I do, that Islam, for instance, is a very serious values challenge to a secular, progressive, democratic society like the ones we like to think we inhabit, what do you do if it turns out that rather than it all being straightforward in the years ahead, we might have just screwed up our entire society? Or let me put it another way. One of the things I say in the book is that this progress in recent decades, in Europe in particular, has gone something like this. We were all walking one way down a street that we believed was liberal democracy. And we believed that over time everyone would join us, or it would certainly be a one-way street which was flowing with people only in one direction. And then at some point, 1989, or some point since, people noticed somebody was walking the other way down the street. And then they noticed more people walking the other way down the street. And gradually in Europe, we started to wonder, nobody wanted to say it aloud, we started to wonder whether a time might not come in which there were more people walking against us than with us. And that this is a very fundamental, very deep worry we have in Europe now. Now, my view is that even the ones who would never admit that have started to worry about that. Maybe it turns out that the Muslims are not going to be great for gay lib. Maybe it turns out that the Muslims are not going to be wonderful on the question of feminism. Maybe there are other groups of people who will have views that we would rather they didn't hold. This is very painful for people who've done this to admit, because as I say, at root is maybe you've screwed up your entire society. But those people then have no answer to this because they can't even admit to the fact. So when we say why do they attack the sort of response, it's because that's all they can do, because they daren't open the can of worms, which is the first problem, because they made it happen. They gave it to us.
Let me give you another example of the kind of attitude I mean. Is that sometimes when I'm talking, I was interviewing somebody on this podcast the other day, and I talked about the rape gangs. And their instant response was to say, yes, of course, there are these Muslim rape gangs, but the vast majority of rapes are committed. They felt they had to utter this sort of self-preservational mantra.
That one is fascinating. I in the book, in The Strange Death of Europe, I say that the rape issue is one of the most interesting because it's one of the earliest warning sirens, and it's happened everywhere. So the reason is always the same, is that not just that people do it, but that the authorities and the media and everyone else always try to cover it up.
Yes.
It's exactly what happened in Rotherham in the UK, is exactly what happened in Cologne in Germany in New Year's Eve 2015, is exactly what's been happening in Sweden for years, exactly what's been happening in Norway and so on. The most recent one we had of the denial, funnily enough, was caused by the President of the United States, Donald Trump, in mentioning Sweden and the rape stats, in which response to which everyone said, no, it's not happening, the numbers are not, no, it's all, it's if you want to see the seriousness of this problem, not only will they not collect these stats in Sweden, but consider, and I mentioned this in the book, consider Norway, where a few years ago a police official admitted that every single case of what they call snatch rape or grab rape, that is, rape where a woman is seized in the street by a total stranger and raped, rather than a marital rape. Every single case of that, this Norwegian police head said, was from a migrant. Now, what is the big cultural difference between Norway and Sweden that means that whereas that is the case in Norway. In Sweden, it's all, as they like to pretend, nothing to do with any of the newcomers. It's just that Swedish men have been more rapey in recent years, or there's more reporting of it, or, as a Swedish MP said recently, and I was doing a show with her, and I could see her practicing her lies beforehand. She had a piece of paper with the lies she had to memorize to get through this. This is all they do. They practice the lies, and this was in Sweden now. The reason why is a reporting thing. It's because if a rape is reported, it's then reported every day subsequently, which is not true. That the one rape is recorded every day of the year as a rape. This is not true. But these are lies people are telling themselves, because what do you do if you're a Swedish MP who backed the historic movement of between 1 to 2% addition of the population in a single year in 2015 into Sweden? What do you do if you're one of the people who said, this is going to be wonderful because we need doctors and we need nurses and we need physicians and brain surgeons and things, and these people will provide that, and you actually turn around and you realize not only is this a massive influx of low-skilled or non-skilled people who don't speak the language into a country that doesn't need any more unskilled labour, that already has a problem of unskilled labour, and has no jobs for people who do not speak Swedish and have no skills. If you were one of the people who had argued for that, and then in addition it turned out that your rape stats went crazy, what would you do? It's like the Angela Merkel thing. What do you do? What do you do when it turns out that most of the people, as I prove in the book, most of the people you brought in weren't refugees, have no more right than anyone else in the world to be in Europe? What do you do? You've got to lie. You've got to.
Yeah. Well, why? I spoke to a German journalist about this, German-speaking journalist of our persuasion, and he said that the reason that Angela Merkel had allowed this to happen is because she was genuinely terrified about the breeding rate declining among ethnic Germans, and that Germany, ever since the 1930s, has been utterly paranoid about its economic security, and that this is why she did it, and why she still gets the support she does. Is that?
Yes, you hear that. Very early in this book, I dismantle the various sets of myths about migration to Europe that have been around for decades. I mean, ever since the post-war period. And I dismantle them for a particular reason, which is that all of the same excuses came back in 2015 to justify the unprecedented wave of migration that was allowed.
So how many came in there? Was that the watershed year?
Yes, because I mean, a country like Germany adding 1 to 2% of its population in a single year.
Is that what it did?
Yeah. In a country of 80 million people, the German security services thought perhaps 1.5 million people entered Germany that year. And when you have a movement like that, what happens is that people reach, it wasn't caused for any of the rationales that have been given. It was the same reason as post-war migration happened. It was all an accident and a cock-up and much deeper things than people credit. But then there are ready-made lies that they seize. So, for instance, after Angela Merkel does this, the Germans say, well, we have a problem with an aging population, and makes sense that we need young people. It's not obvious to me that if you have a problem of an aging population, which, by the way, is not only a problem, it's always talked about as if it's only a problem. But let's say you have that. It's not obvious to me that instead of, for instance, raising the retirement age or addressing the pensions deficit and so on, it's not obvious to me that the best solution to that is to import the next generation of Germans from Eritrea. It doesn't automatically follow, to my mind. Now, some people think it does. But here's a strange one about this. The people who tell that lie, we have an aging population, so we must ask young people from around the world to come in, have one big hurdle in particular to explain, which I've never heard any of them explain to me, and I've asked a lot of people. If it's a case that Germany, for instance, has an aging population, and that it wants to address that by bringing in younger people to do jobs, why does it not invite the 40% or so of young Italians, young Portuguese, young Spaniards, young Greeks who do not have a job and have no prospects of a job in their home countries to come into Germany? If the EU and European unity meant anything, surely it would mean that. Get the young workforce who have been destroyed in these Mediterranean countries into Germany. It's not a very large leap culturally. It's a bit of a leap, but not much of one, for a young Greek person to go and live and work in Germany. It's certainly much less of a leap than bringing people in from, for instance, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Eritrea, Nigeria, Chad, Niger, and all of North Africa. It's much less of a leap, and these people are more likely to be part of German society and to benefit it and benefit from it.
How much of this stuff was speeded up, at least, by people like George Soros, people, sort of left-wing ideologues who believe in open borders and helping out, encouraging more refugees to come?
Huge amount. And I say this carefully because there are people who, as it were, go nuts on the Soros thing and attribute him to sort of like the modern Rothschild blaming. You know, I mean, there's an unpleasant tinge in the air sometimes around Soros. But if you look at what he and his NGOs did during the crisis of 2015, it was a wicked, wicked thing. And the fact that Viktor Orban in Hungary publicly named Soros, he got a huge amount of criticism for this, but he was right, I think. George Soros is meddling in Hungarian affairs. That the country's richest and most famous son should have been campaigning to I mean, there was a moment when there was exchange in which Viktor Orban blamed Soros, and Soros responded, yes, he is right to identify it, because, as Soros said in a statement, that Orban thinks the refugees are the problem and that the borders are the solution. We think differently. We think that the refugees are the solution and the borders are the problem. Soros's NGOs, and I've seen this on the front lines in the migrant camps, have been over the years helping migrants not just to come into Europe, but to lie when they get here about who they are. Yeah. They're taught via apps and via websites. You can see the websites. Many of them are still up. And by leaflets and other means, they are shown how to beat the system. Not that the system in Europe works very well at all. I mean, the whole system, as I show in the book, was defunct and broken by the time that the 2015 movement happened. But very quickly, this goes back to a point you raised earlier, and I didn't actually answer, which is a very interesting and important point about where is different in Europe. And of course, one of the fundamental questions about the migration crisis of 2015 and the period before and since is, why has the East behaved differently?
Yes, Poland, Slovakia, Hungary. Here's an interesting one. Viktor Orban, I think everyone would agree, is a right-wing leader. Neighbouring in Slovakia, Robert Fico is a left-wing leader. Now, the Prime Minister of Slovakia and the Prime Minister of Hungary agree absolutely on the migrants question and on the Islam and identity question, despite being right-wing in Hungary, left-wing in Slovakia. Why is this? This is a fascinating subject to me because there are very specific reasons, including the fact that the vast majority of the publics there are totally opposed to the mass migration and support their leaders in opposing it. But another reason I would submit, or another two reasons I would submit, are firstly, that Eastern Europe remembers some of this better. That in the East, where armies in the past came in, remember this thing in particular. And a second reason is that they have something that Western Europeans have lost. I say in the book, if you were to boil it down to something, it would be that Eastern Europe still retains the tragic sense of life, and that Western Europeans have lost it utterly. We think we've got time off from history. We wish everything away on a tide of human progress. We pretend we don't die. We pretend that the point of life is to acquire more and more things and go on nice holidays. And Eastern Europeans have remembered you don't get time off from history.
and that you may be swept away from one direction and then swept away from another, and you ought to be careful with your society.
Freedom isn't free, as the
Indeed.
Americans would put it. You're listening to Delingpole, the podcast with me, James Delingpole, and my very special guest, Douglas Murray, author of many excellent books, the latest being The Strange Death of Europe.
Check out the official Breitbart store today. Store.breitbart.com is the home for the brand new official Breitbart store. Head there now for products for women and men, like t-shirts, baseball tees, tank tops, hoodies, and hats, or an unapologetically American belt buckle. Store.breitbart.com has these items and many more, so get your gear now at store.breitbart.com. This is Delingpole, a Breitbart.com podcast. Here once again is James Delingpole.
Welcome back to Delingpole, the podcast with me, your lovely friend, James Delingpole, and his even lovelier friend, Douglas Murray, author of The Strange Death of Europe. Douglas, I promised my lovely listener that I would not depress him or her anymore, that at the final segment we would offer a glimmer of hope amid the gloom. So help me out here, Douglas, because it seems so depressing. I mean, we've thrown away centuries, millennia of civilization.
Yes.
On frivolities.
Yes, I mean, we made the mistake of thinking that what we have gained was normal and would go on forever. We may have just thrown it away. That's possible. And toward the end of my book, I lay out two scenarios. One of what we could do even at this stage, and the other of what I think is more likely if we continue on the course we're on. But since I want to raise your point of trying to be positive, I may as well say some of the things that can be done. The first is that we do have some of the tools for answering this. And I don't just mean cultural tools, which we have, despite what our enemies say and the essentializing, as I said, of our opponents. Nobody has a better reservoir of history and culture to draw upon to steel them to realizing we do deserve to exist and that we shouldn't abolish ourselves. We also have some of the thought tools. I say towards the end, we have got to a point in our political discussion in particular where everybody is Hitler or an anti-fascist, or it's I'm right, you're wrong, I'm good, you're evil. And when it comes to something as complex as the migrant crisis, and I tried to in this book lay out the complexity of it, why we know that we can't have people drowning on our doorstep, and on the other hand we can't bring in the world. That instead of this being a discussion between good and evil, between Nazi and anti-fascist, between sweet, lovely actress going to Calais and nasty boot boy racist, that actually what this is about is what Aristotle showed us is a problem of what happens when two virtues collide. Europe in recent years has been trying to deal with competing virtues. On this case, I say it's a competition between justice and mercy. Mercy for the person who arrives on your doorstep, but justice for your own people. These are competing virtues, and they're not black and white. They're not absolutely simple. I know from speaking to many migrants firsthand in the camps, the people who come here for a better life economically, who have very good reasons to be here, albeit that they shouldn't be here, and the asylum seekers who have been through hell and seen things that we can't imagine. So it's not easy, but we do have the tools actually of rationalism from our own tradition to try to find a way through this, and I think we should be applying them. It should be recognized, I say, of competing virtues, not about I'm good, you're evil. Because we're going to have to be far more subtle and careful to try to get through this. I also think we need to go back to first principles, and we need to ask ourselves a question we should have asked a long time ago. Who is Europe for? My answer is that it is primarily the home of the people who have been here. And that if we have people coming in at a slow rate, then they are welcome to join us, as long as they join us. but that when they come in at this rate, we can't possibly cope, and that we're setting up our society for crash. So we need to ask these questions and also answer them. It's not only about having a debating society for the rest of time. And we have, as I say, some of the tools to answer this. There are specific things we can do to slow the flow. And if you look across Europe at the publics, everybody has the same demand of the politicians. Just slow the flow down. You don't have to say nobody more, ever. But you also can't pretend that Europe is the home for anyone in the world who wants to move in and call it home. It's not possible. We can't sustain it. Societally, economically, no way can we sustain it. And so we can do various things. The first is that Frontex and the European naval vessels and the various NGOs should stop acting as half of the smuggling gang's operation. By which I mean that now the smugglers don't even bother to put very much petrol in the boats when they send them off from the North African shoreline, because they know that they only have to go out a few miles now, and they're met by the European vessels who bring them into Europe. We're doing the smugglers' job for them. I give the Australian example and others to say what we could do in stopping that flow. And I also think if we wanted to, we could do something which, again, I said at the beginning of the crisis we should think about, because it'll happen one day, which is to process people's applications to the extent that there are asylum seekers outside of Europe. People should not come into Europe and then have their status worked out, because nobody ever goes. And as I say, if you take Frans Timmermans, the Vice President of the European Commission, own figures from 2016, which he got from Frontex, he said then at least 60% of the arrivals in 2015 have no right to be here. Now, Germany is not going to deport 750,000 people from 2015. Sweden, despite the boasts of some of its ministers when they try to sound hard, is not going to deport 80,000 people. They find it incredibly hard to deport anyone. So you've got to not allow people in and then try to work it out. You've got to keep them out and then decide who you do want to take in. And on asylum cases, I say we've got to be serious about temporary asylum. People are very suspicious about temporary asylum, and they have a right to be suspicious. In Sweden, a lot of people who fled the Balkan Wars in the 90s are still in Sweden. So no wonder the public are suspicious about them when they say, oh, the Syrians will go home at some point. Their experience is that they don't. So there's a lot of these sort of things they can do. But fundamentally, James, it comes back to this point about ourselves. Do we want to survive? Do we want our home to be a recognisable place? Do we have the right to make it so or allow it to remain so? And if the answer, led I think by Germany, is no, then I suppose we should just continue to enjoy our lifestyle and go on holiday and buy things for the time we have. But I think that we shouldn't be led over the cliff by this sentiment, and that we start solving this by realizing, as I say, that we have the tools ourselves, and the tools of rationalism, the tools of history, the tools of culture, the tools of education and learning, which are not just not nothing, but the best tools anyone in the world could have.
Do you see any sign in our political class that they have any kind of appetite to deal with this problem? Because I'm looking at the Theresa May's new manifesto. I see a Conservative administration which wants to brush this whole thing under the carpet. They're not interested in dealing with this issue, which is on so many people's minds.
Yes, it's true. That's it's almost unspeakable in the political class. It reminds me of something that Martin Amis got out of Tony Blair about 10 years ago, when Blair was coming to the end of his time in office, and Martin Amis asked him in an interview, did he and other European leaders ever talk of the demography question and the European demographics question? And Blair said, it's a subterranean conversation. It's a bit less subterranean now than it was then, but it still is bubbling underneath the surface and is very rarely credited above it. For the time being, mentioning these issues in the political class wouldn't just be raising an issue that's too big for one politician to address. It would also be, I mean, it's like going on to issue of Animal Hospital or one of these sort of pet rescue programs and talking about bestiality. I mean, it's so far off what you're meant to do. Like, if you or I went to a Conservative Party manifesto press launch and said, what are you going to do about our civilization and this existential problem?
Yeah.
It would be worse than if you just took your trousers down and exposed yourself. I mean, it's such bad manners for the time being to think about these most vital things, because our political system is set up to say, to ask a question of the Prime Minister or to make a manifesto pledge which says, we're going to cut VAT on new businesses by 0.5%.
Yes. I wonder whether perhaps part of the extraordinary hysteria against Donald Trump stems from his fairly outspoken views on issues like this. I say towards the end of the book that if people realise the sort of depth of this problem and how bad this could go unless this is addressed from the political mainstream, they could do no better than consider the gap between Donald Trump's statements on the suspension of travel from 7 Muslim-majority countries. An 8-week travel suspension, was it? Yep.
From 7 countries.
Yep.
The entire civilized world said, how could anyone be such a fascist? I mean, you're basically doing Auschwitz again.
Yeah.
And compare that was in February, wasn't it? Late January. Yeah. Compare that with a far harder question asked of 10 European publics by a think tank in London at the same time, that asked the public of 10 European countries a far harder question than Donald Trump had raised. Donald Trump was just 7 unstable countries he wanted a temporary travel ban from, which you can agree with or disagree with, but At the same time, this think tank in London asked 10 European publics, do they agree or disagree with the statement they want 0 more Muslims in their country? 0, not 1. In 8 out of the 10 European countries, the majority of the public agreed with the sentiment they didn't want 1 more Muslim in their country. And that included a majority in France and a majority in Germany. And only 2 countries in Europe out of those 10 was that not a majority opinion. And one of them was Spain, which has actually dodged the migration of recent years, interestingly enough. But the other was Britain. In Britain, only 47% of the public said they didn't want 1 more Muslim in their country. So you go from that, and I make no comment about whether this is a wise thing or an unwise thing or right or wrong. I simply say, just look at the gap, and you see that, as the American scholar of Islam, Daniel Pipes, pointed out some time ago, the strange thing in recent years, among other things, has been that, to use a rather grotesque right-left analogy, whilst the publics have been stampeding to the right on these questions, their politicians have, in reaction, stampeded towards the left. And this leaves a very dangerous amount of space between the public and their representatives. And we are currently at the end of a political season of people who said, after Brexit and Trump, it'll be Frexit and Nexit and Detexit and Wexit and so on. And they overplayed it. And for electoral reasons and lots of reasons, Geert Wilders was never going to become Prime Minister in Holland and form a coalition. And all sorts of reasons we all know about. Le Pen was highly unlikely to become the President of France this year. And so what happens is, for the time being, the European political mainstream continues to say, hurrah, we dodged it, because we're doing so well. So the Freedom Party in Austria only got 46% of the vote. And Geert Wilders only came second in the Dutch elections. And only a third of the French electorate voted for a member of the Le Pen family to lead their country. And Jean-Claude Juncker and Angela Merkel and the others who are screwing up our continent say, you see, it is a victory for our common sense and the political mainstream. I think unless the political mainstream stretches out and takes the public back into its fold, we have very big problems coming in Europe.
And they're being aided and abetted, are they not, by the journalistic class and the sort of our public intellectuals?
Yeah.
I mean, we were talking earlier, weren't we, about how difficult it is just speaking the truth, just serving up simple facts in public. You do it, I do it occasionally. Tom Holland made a good program about it the other day. Tommy Robinson is out there at the sort of on the wilder fringes of I mean, I think he's very brave what he's doing, but we're going against the grain, and we get so much hatred for it for just doing our job.
Yes, I am not to be too self-aggrandizing, but it's a part of a trend I describe in the book as being a modern European vice, which is, and I know it happens in America as well, but it's particularly prominent in Europe, where everybody who shouts fire is immediately decried as an arsonist and is thought to be the person who started the fire. The most obvious example being Ayaan Hirsi Ali in the Netherlands, who became, as Salman Rushdie said, probably the first political asylum seeker to the US since World War II. It was this Somali immigrant of Muslim background saying, we have an integration problem, an Islam problem, a values problem here. The Dutch society ended up getting her out. She was causing the trouble. And they thought, if we can get rid of her, I mean, Fortuyn's already gone, Van Gogh's being killed, and if this difficult black Somali ex-Muslim goes, then it will be okay again.
Yes.
Lo and behold, that isn't the case. But in the same way that prosecuting Michael Welbeck for writing novels and expressing opinions in novels turns out not to have saved the life of a single Parisian. But the presumption has always been along the way, we've got to keep a lid on the whole thing. If you say it's not working, you'll make it not work. If you say that there are problems, you'll create the problems. If you say there's a fire, it means you must have started a fire.
But isn't it also part of that self-hatred that you analyse so brilliantly in the book? The idea that we are worthless, our culture is worthless, we deserve this stuff, therefore this bad shit that's happening to us must be our fault. Therefore, we must sacrifice certain members of our community in order to appease the gods and hope it'll go away.
Yes, like offering up a girl to be eaten by the gods at some point.
Yeah.
Yes, it's there is something in this. I think this is a temporary phase. I mean, I really do feel that this is a temporary phase.
What signs of hope do you see, Douglas?
One is that there are far more people willing to identify this than there were before. A number of people have been in touch with me actually since this book came out in the UK on May the 4th saying, I would have expected more witch burning by now, more auto-da-fe. And
by which they meant what, sorry?
That a larger number of people would have been decrying this.
Throwing the toys out of the pram
And I'll tell you another thing, by the way. This is a bit self-serving, but if I can't do that on a podcast with you, James, where could I?
Yeah.
Among the reception of my book so far, we've had some wonderful reviews, and it's a bestseller already, as you mentioned. But there have been a couple of pannings, as I'd expect, including one from The Guardian.
No, really?
It totally floored me, that.
Yeah.
And they accused me of xenophobia. I tell you one thing, it strikes me, is that about 10 years ago, I remember, when The Guardian, I think, accused Martin Amis, I mentioned earlier, of racism. It was a huge thing because everyone had to defend him against it, and he had to write a sort of fawning, please, I promise I'm not a racist, peace, and so on and so forth. And I'm not saying I'm Martin Amis, obviously, and he has more of a sort of left wing as well as a bigger reputation to defend. But when The Guardian, did this kind of racism accusation drive-by shooting recently on me, I wasn't bothered at all. And I don't really know anyone who was, and readers seem not to have been, because the magic curse words and the spell words that the left has been using for a generation and more to shut this down don't work anymore. They don't work. I mean, maybe there are some people who think that underneath my genial facade I'm actually waiting to burn everyone. But I think most people don't think that and can see that and are increasingly suspicious of the dishonesty of the Guardian types who just have been shouting racist at everyone for decades and know that these words don't mean anything anymore. And if I were one of those people, by the way, I would have started to worry about that by now. Why is my spell not working anymore? Why does it seem to be weaker and weaker with every application? I think this is a good thing, but if I were them, I would start to worry that down the line, this overuse could be a problem.
Let's close by... Do you remember the conversation we had with the man in the street who accosted you in the street today? I was rather surprised by that, I mean, in a good way.
Yes, James and I were walking down the street in London, and a very nice gentleman came forward to speak with me. And what did he say? He said that I want to remind you that most Muslims are against this.
He was Muslim.
He was Muslim himself. He said that at the very end.
Yeah.
He said most Muslims are opposed to what the crazies are doing and so on. But he also said, didn't he, that this is a Christian country and you've got to hold on to that.
He said, don't let Islam take over. He said in Saudi Arabia they would never allow a Christian mayor of a city. So it's quite strong stuff, really,
yes,
from a Muslim.
Absolutely. But a reason for hope, I mean, there are some, is that those people do emerge now, and there are some saying it publicly. My view is that the cleverer people and the more sensitive people are aware that this is the best deal anyone's ever had. I mean, if you were historic, I know that the Islamists and others all want to portray our society as basically being the most Islamophobic, to use a stupidest word, the most Islamophobic, racist, bigoted societies on earth. But actually, the cleverer, more sensitive ones realise not only is that not the case, but that it's the best place now for anyone who's a Muslim, among everything else and everyone else. And that if you're a Shia Muslim in Saudi, you're going to have a problem if you're a Sunni Muslim in other parts of the Muslim world, and that if you're an Ahmadiyya anywhere, and if you're I mean, it's just endless grief in these really terrible places. And that the fact that people are claiming that this place, where they've got it best, would be the place where they've got it worst. Only the Islamists really push that, and the people that they manage to influence. But outside of those noisy parts of their communities, there are these people like that gentleman earlier, who know that they are very lucky, that they're living on an inheritance which has been created here. And as I always say, if you honestly think that a Western liberal democratic society in the 21st century is the worst place in the world to be, you just wait till you see the world.